everybody, welcome to this webinar. This is one of a series by the UK Warehousing Association. My name's Claire Bottle, I'm the Chief Executive, and I'm really delighted that we're working with Aaron and Partners, our legal specialists. And today we're welcoming Simon Edwards, who's going to talk to us about property. So dilapidations, decoration, contracts, leasing, purchasing, there's a lot to cover. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Simon, and we're all looking forward to hearing more about this topic.
Thanks very much, Claire. Today's talk is a bit narrower than that. Because these are bite-sized, we're focusing a bit more, and so I'm talking about dilapidations and decorating obligations in particular. There is so much material in relation to leasing that I could drone on all day, but that's not what anybody wants. So next slide, please, Charlotte. So the overview, what we're talking about is lease clauses that require tenants to keep the property in good repair and decorated during the lease and leave it that way at the end. Now, decoration obligations tend to be a separate clause in a lease. It's often skipped over. And what we find often in warehouse leases is that the decoration obligations may be unrealistic. So for instance, you may have a galvanized steel structure or a powder coated one, and the lease says it's got to be painted every 3 years. It doesn't make sense. In terms of what do we mean by dilapidations, we're talking about assessing and dealing with defects for which the tenant's responsible. And the general principle is the tenant should do the work of repair and maintenance, but the landlord can do it if the tenant doesn't. Another thing to watch out for in leases is service charge provisions, which are intended to allow the landlord to recoup expenditure that's there for common purposes, but they can sometimes be drafted in a way that enables the landlord to pass the cost of capital improvements onto the tenant. Which can be pretty unfair if you're getting limited benefit from a tenant. You know, you may only be in for 3 or 5 years, and you're looking at paying for something that has a payback over 20 years. In terms of leases, I have yet to meet a client who goes, oh good, there's a commercial property lease for me to read. But the clauses in leases contain potentially major financial exposure for the tenant. And they're not always realised, and frequently you see that potential repairing obligations aren't provided for in company accounts. So a lease, even though it makes your eyes glaze over and you look for something else to do, is a potentially major commitment and needs to be understood. So next slide, please. Right, in terms of the repairing obligations that typically appear in a lease, a landlord will usually want the tenant to put and keep the property in repair. And that means whatever the state of it at the beginning of the lease, the tenant is expected to put the property into good repair if it isn't, and to leave it in good repair at the end of the lease. The other thing landlords will want to pass on to tenants is the obligation to improve the premises or upgrade them to comply with statutory requirements, for instance, insulation standards, and that can be very expensive. If you're a tenant, you will want the lease to say that there's no obligation on you to do work which would improve the property beyond the state it was in at the start of the lease. Whether you can do that depends very much on what the balance of bargaining power is. At the moment, the balance of bargaining power seems to be with landlords because there is a shortage of decent warehousing accommodation. If you are able to get the landlord to agree that there's no obligation to improve the property, that needs to be evidenced by a schedule of condition prepared by a surveyor before the lease is signed and exhibited to it. And if you can't get that, you will definitely want a survey doing so you know what you're in for in terms of having to do repairs. Decoration, as I said, is normally a separate duty, and so it's not automatically covered by the schedule of condition and limiting the repair obligation. It's often assumed that if you have got a limit on the extent of repairs, that will also apply to decoration, but it isn't unless you specifically provide that. Decoration obligations and repairing obligations apply during the lease and not just at the end. Most landlords seem to be reasonably relaxed about that, but not all. Rent review clauses will assume that the tenant's done the repairs it ought to, even if that's not the case. And the final point on this slide is, however unappealing it is, you need to read and understand the lease and its important implications before you sign it, because once you capitalise the rent and the potential repairing obligations under a lease, it's usually a lot of money. Next slide, please. I've mentioned break clauses in here. This talk isn't about break clauses, but repairs are relevant to them. Break clauses are a minefield with lots of traps for the unwary. And before the lease is signed or before you exercise a break clause, you need to check the lease for onerous preconditions and you need to comply exactly. Now, many leases require that the tenant's obligations, and that will include repairing and decorating, must have been complied with at the break date. And some even require that when the break notice is given. So to have a valid lease break, you need to have done all the repairs either before the break date, if that's what the lease says, or before the break notice is given. Now, ideally, a break clause would simply require that the rent's been paid up to date, but it's not always possible to achieve that. If you do exercise a break, then you do need enough time left to wind down your operations, do the repairs, clear the rubbish, and move out before the lease ends. And that means that if you've got a fixed term contract with a customer for whom you're storing in that warehouse, that needs to end before the end of the lease. So you've got time enough to deal with these things. Next slide, please. So when you get to the end of the lease and there are dilapidations to be dealt with, there's a choice. Do you arrange the repairs and the redecoration yourself, or do you leave it to the landlord to do? It's not a straightforward decision. There isn't usually a right answer, and the answer will depend on the circumstances. Either way, it makes sense to get an update schedule of condition so you can see what work there is that needs doing. Now, the landlord surveyor will always prepare a schedule of dilapidations. This lists every single item of work that they can possibly think of and a generous provision for the cost of, or the anticipated cost of doing it. And usually when you get these things, they are overstated and frequently grossly so. So to give you an example, I dealt with a dilapidations matter a few years ago where the landlord surveyor's schedule of dilapidations put the cost of rectification at £2.2 million. We eventually did a deal at £350,000, which just shows you how much these things can constitute a work of fiction. Anyway, going back to that decision, do you do it yourself or at least arrange it yourself? If you do, then you're in control of the expenditure on that. So you've got some control on costs. And on the assumption that you'll be VAT registered, which I would think will be universal, you can claim the VAT charged for doing those repairs. So that also keeps the cost down. The problems with doing it yourself, the landlord may be unhelpful if you ask him to approve the work that's been done. So if you say, well, we've done this to deal with this, is that okay? Sometimes the landlord will say yes, and sometimes they'll say no, and what further is needed, and sometimes they just don't answer. So that can be somewhat troublesome. You need to allow time to get the work done before the lease ends, because you've got to give vacant possession of the property at the end of the lease period. You can't stay in there to carry on doing the work unless the landlord agrees. You may find if you do the repairs yourself that you do work that turns out to be unnecessary. So in some circumstances, it may be cheaper to pay the landlord for him to get the dilapidations done. Next slide, please. The other alternative is to leave it to the landlord. Now, the starting point for a landlord and a landlord surveyor is normally the projected cost of getting all the repairs and decoration done. So this is done at a point where no work has been done. And they pitch up with a detailed schedule with lots and lots of items in it and a price against each one of them and a total at the end. Now, the landlord doesn't have to do all the work that he's listed in his schedule, because what this is an estimation of what it will cost to do what the tenant should have done under the lease. While that's the usual method, that is, add up all the projected cost of doing the work, it isn't always the right one, because the cost of doing work may not actually reflect the value that it gives to the landlord. I've mentioned before that the landlord's schedule is usually beyond what's actually needed. And sometimes I've seen these prepared by somebody who doesn't appear to have read the lease, or at least not understood it, because you do find that there is provision for work to be done that simply isn't required by the lease. And as I've said, sometimes the cost estimates are overstated. The landlord may not do all the work for which it's claiming. That doesn't stop it claiming it, but it is a point to deal with in negotiations. If the landlord is doing the work, then obviously as tenant you have very limited control over the repair costs that are actually incurred. Usually the lease will require that the tenant pays the landlord surveyor's costs for engaging in this exercise. I'll refrain from calling it a pantomime. What usually happens after a schedule of dilapidations has been prepared is that there is a lengthy battle between the landlords and the tenant surveyors, arguing over the items and what it would cost to fix them. And usually, eventually, agreement is reached on a compromised figure some months down the line. In terms of VAT, if the landlord is not charging rent on VAT, which may be because he's not registered for VAT, or maybe because he's not opted to tax the lease and the property. So if the landlord isn't charging VAT on the rent, then any VAT on costs he incurs will be passed on by him, but won't be reclaimable by the tenant. And that's because the services of repair have not been rendered to the tenant, they've been rendered to the landlord. And it's only the person to whom they've been rendered who can reclaim the VAT. Well, if the landlord hasn't opted to tax the property or isn't registered for VAT, then he can't recover the VAT. So, that's a 20% margin potentially. The tenant will usually also have to compensate the landlord for a period in which the premises are unlettable after the lease ends, while the repair work's being done, and that gives scope for a considerable amount of argument as to what that might be and how much the landlord has lost in potential rent. And of course, brings about the interesting question of whether the property could have been let during that period. The landlord will say, well, of course it could be, and the tenant will say, well, we don't think so. So there are uncertainties from leaving it to the landlord. Next slide, please. There are limits on dilapidations claims. There's a little known piece of legislation called the Landlord and Tenant Act 1927. And this applies where the tenant hasn't done the repairs, so the landlord's going to do them, or at least claim for the cost of doing them. And the landlord's claiming compensation for that, and that's whether or not the landlord has done the work, or indeed whether he intends to. And what the 1927 Act says is, in principle, the landlord can't claim more than the amount by which the value of his interest in the property has been reduced by the failure to repair. Nor can the landlord claim the cost of repairs, which would add no value to the property. And the classic example of that is where the landlord intends to demolish and redevelop the property, or reconstruct it, or he's going to convert it. For instance, something that's happened quite a lot recently is the conversion of offices into flats. Now, we're not talking about warehouses there, but it's always something to be looked at. So it's always useful to find out what the landlord is planning to do with the property after the lease ends. With a modern unit, clearly he's going to re-let it. With an old unit, you don't know. So ask the landlord what it intends to do with the property after the lease. You might get a straight answer, you might not. Check planning applications, see whether the landlord is offering the property for re-let or for sale. And that will give you an idea as to what the landlord's intentions are with the property. Now, as I've said, he doesn't need to do all the work he's claimed for, but it is relevant as to what he's going to do with the property and what he might, in fact, do in the way of repairs, because there is always stuff in a schedule of dilapidations that isn't going to get done. It's there to beef up the landlord's case for the purposes of negotiating a deal. So that's a rather rapid trot through some of the key points on leases and dilapidations. The key things out of it are: read the lease before you sign it. Certainly be aware of the key issues relating to repairs and decorations and the standard that's required. Be aware of issues around break clauses and what the conditions would be to exercising those, because once you've signed the lease, you're committed and you can't change it. During the lease, keep an eye on what you're supposed to do and when under the lease. And then obviously, as you get towards the end of the lease, you need to be planning. If you are not going to be renewing, you need to be planning your timescale for vacating the property, leave time for the repair work to be done if you're going to do it, but it may make sense to leave it to the landlord. That's a discussion to be had with your surveyor at a decent time before the end of the lease, so you have got time to make plans and implement them. Anyway, that's all for today in this bite-size offering. I hope you find that useful. If you would like to contact us with inquiries, we'd be happy to deal with them. But back to you, Claire.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Simon. That was really, really interesting. And it's not all that often that we hear about legislation from 100 years ago. So interesting to hear that in some cases it is still relevant. One of the things I was kind of interested in is the potential for these rules to kind of compromise the ability to go green. You know, in warehousing, and especially with COP26 that we've just had, there's a real focus on trying not to do things which are unsustainable and not to create unnecessary waste. And a simple example that I'm aware of is, you know, with the digitalization of warehousing these days, you'll quite often install some kind of IT equipment. And then according to the dilapidations clause, you'd be expected to rip it all out again, even though you know that whoever the next occupier is probably going to need a Wi-Fi system. Is there anything that tenants can do to kind of to argue against that on the grounds of environmental concerns?
Strictly speaking, no. And I mean, going back when I was a trainee, which is rather a long time ago now, we used to see regularly leases with an obligation on the tenant to paint the premises with 3 coats of good lead paint, despite the fact that lead paint had been outlawed for at least 25 years by then. So there's stuff that crops up in leasing that is nonsensical in environmental terms. And this, sadly, is one of the reasons why you do need to read leases to get a feel for it. The example you've given of Wi-Fi is actually quite a good example. It's a very good example, because leases will normally require the tenant to reinstate the premises as they were at the start of the lease. So in theory, the landlord could say, you need to take out the Wi-Fi equipment. You haven't done it, so here's an item in the schedule of dilapidations for removal of the Wi-Fi equipment. Despite the fact, as you say, that the new tenant will be very happy to get premises that are already wired up. and indeed may even be prepared to pay a slightly higher rent for the privilege. So the landlord is looking to make a gain at both ends in that circumstance. Now, you would hope you're dealing with a landlord who is commercial, but there are landlords whose business model basically involves screwing every penny out of the tenants when they can. What is perhaps more significant with environmental issues is where legislation requires property to be upgraded. And this is a particular issue with older property. And it may be insulation standards. You know, it may be things like asbestos. There are still plenty of properties out there with asbestos, which is okay, as long as it's not disturbed. But landlords may say, well, it no longer complies with the legislation. So you, the tenant, have undertaken to put the property in good repair and comply with legislation, which is normally another separate clause in the lease. So therefore, you've got to pay to take the asbestos out. So, or perhaps tying in with the COP26 example, the insulation levels are not sufficient and they need to be improved to comply with new regulations. So that falls to you, tenant, because you've agreed to make the property comply with statutory obligations. So there's lots of traps in there, and they're all hidden in a turgid, lengthy, unappealing document written in legalese, which makes it even worse.
It sounds as though, at least on a short lease, it could end up adding half as much again to the cost of doing business.
If in the wrong circumstances, it can be a stunningly expensive situation to find yourself in. I mean, I dealt with a case a while back with a floor slab in a warehouse, and obviously, you know, with forklift trucks and the loads that are carried, you know, a floor slab has essentially got to be perfect. Well, if you've got a floor slab that cracks, can you patch it? Maybe. Do you have to replace it? Well, maybe. What's the cost of replacing a floor slab? Well, it's huge. And you can't use the warehouse while you're at it. So, you know, it's very important to understand what you're taking on. And certainly with a short lease, you really don't want to be taking on a repairing obligation. My advice to people is, if you're taking a lease on for less than 10 years, you're probably better negotiating a lease that doesn't require you to do repairs, and recognise that you may be paying, well, you will be paying a higher rent for the privilege. But with all these things, you're balancing a cost in terms of rent against the uncertainty of what repairs you may have to do. If you're renting a brand new warehouse, you might find that there is stuff that crops up that might be regarded as snagging. If the builder sorts it out, great. If the builder doesn't sort it out, it's probably your responsibility as tenant. Now, that doesn't sound very fair, and it may not be intuitive, but everything depends on the terms of the lease.
A good argument for reading it, as you say.
Absolutely, or at least getting your lawyer to read it very thoroughly and explain to you what all the important stuff is. The slight snag with that is that the number of lawyers who've actually run a warehouse or worked in it is small. I can claim to be, I haven't run a warehouse, but I've worked in one. And so lawyers will not always understand the practical issues that might crop up in repairing. And I gave an example earlier of a galvanized steel structure that the lease says has to be painted. Well, why would you paint a galvanized structure? But that's what the lease says, because it's a standard form lease. So it's always worth thinking through or talking through the implications of a repairing clause. And I've said a repairing clause, I'm also including decorating an obligation to comply with statutory requirements, because it's very easy to skate over these things when you're reading a lease document. You know, in the hurry to get to the exciting bit near the end. And there isn't an exciting bit anywhere.
Oh dear. Well, I think we're very lucky to have such expertise from Aaron and Partners. So thank you very much, Simon. I hope that people who are watching this back will find it as interesting as we did who were on the call. Yeah, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.